I was in a discussion with other preachers, and the topic came up saying how to put the title of the sermon. And I said, well, I don't have titles in my sermon. Well, there's no place for title in the pew sheet or anywhere, so I don't have to make a title for my sermon. And I don't know whether I'm right in not putting the titles in the sermon, but certainly Bible writers didn't have titles for their books. The titles of the books that we have for the Bible are mostly given in the later time, mainly by the name of the author. So the Gospel according to Matthew, for example, Matthew wrote it. Or letter of Peter, first letter of Peter, because there are two letters, you say for distinguish by first or second. He didn't write saying, okay, the title should be first letter of Peter, or something like that. But some of the books, because for some reason they just had to put some names there and titles there, and some of them have some strange names, like Deuteronomy. Well, I say it is strange, not only because most English speakers do not understand it. Deuteronomy, what does that mean? But even when we translate it into English, which means second law, the second law, why should this be called second law? It is not secondary by any means. It is God's law, so it should be secondary. And it is not like the law is only given in 2 times, so it should be called second time that it was given. So it's a mystery why it's called Deuteronomy. Actually, it comes from Greek word, and that word Deuteronomy appears once in this book, in Greek translation, although it's never in the Hebrew original. So maybe it is because of that. Anyway, that's why I prefer calling these books by the author, Moses' 5th book, as is true in German translation. Anyway, that's what it is. And Deuteronomy is not really about the second law, but it is about Moses' farewell sermon. God told Moses that he is about to die. So he gives his last sermon before he dies. And in this sermon, there's lots of law elements. In other words, God's commands. That might be why it's called Deuteronomy. But there's also lots of elements about history of people of Israel, mainly since they came out of Egypt until they arrived at this point about to enter the promised land. And that history is a lot about sins. Moses mainly pointed out how they sinned, how they rebelled against God. But at the same time, it is about grace, because he also points out how God forgave them at the end and just showed his love. So it is in the context of this sin and forgiveness that Moses presents this law or the commands. And this week's reading, today's reading, also has these elements before that. On this particular case, he points out their sins at Mount Horeb, when God made covenant with his people, and Moses went up to the mountain for 40 days so that he will receive God's law more fully. But then it is during these 40 days, people got impatient and made an idol. They rebelled against God. So they sinned, and God was angry with them. But at the end, God forgave them and gave the new tablets for the people, new tablets of the law, which is really called the 10 Commandments often. And it is in this context he says, and now Israel. So now when he says, in now Israel, he says, now remembering that you have sinned, but God has forgiven you and God renewed his covenant with you. Then remember this, or do this. And he says, what does the Lord your God ask of you, except to fear the Lord your God by walking in all his ways, to love him and to worship the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. So by saying this, he's really showing that God's main requirement is on their attitude or in the direction of their life rather than each individual small details. Not that details are unimportant, but the first important thing is that we have to walk to the right direction. We have to have the right attitude, which is to love God and to fear God and to worship God, or the word worship here, in other translations, is translated as serve, because worship here means the worship as a lifestyle, not as particular worships. So that's what we are supposed to do. We are supposed to serve God. And the next part is keep the Lord's commands and statutes. If we truly love God and fear God and serve God, then we have to keep His words. We have to keep His commands. And that's why our psalm, and also the sentence, which is sentence of the day as well, the first part of our psalm says, "Blessed are those whose way is pure, who walk in the law of the Lord." So our main commandment is to love God. But to keep these commands, we also have to know who God is. It is essential that we know who God is. And therefore, He just gives praises of God, explanation of God, description of God. The heavens, indeed the highest heavens, belong to the Lord your God, as does the earth and everything in it. This is something to keep in mind. God is a God of all things. God is a creator of all things. And if God is a creator, He owns all things. We have to always keep this in mind. We might think that we know it. Of course, isn't it natural if God is a creator of all things belong to God? But do we keep these things always in mind? Do we always think of God as the owner of all things? That is something that we always have to keep in mind. Then the next part is also important. Yet the Lord had His heart set on your fathers and loved them. By their fathers, what Moses means Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who were their ancestors. And from this, the people of Israel came from. It says, while this God who is greater and who owns all things particularly loved Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, in order grandfather, father, son, and their descendants. So He chose you particularly. So it is also important to keep this choice or election in mind. That God chose His people specially. Although all things belong to God, God specifically loves these people. And now that election is extended to all nations. It's not just Israel, but all people that God calls to join His people. But election is still limited in the sense not all people accept this invitation. Those people accept these invitations are Christians, and we are God's chosen people. So this is something that we should be proud of, but we should also remember about God. God is God of all things, yet God specifically loves us in a special way. We have to remember this. Therefore, so this is the response of knowing God. Circumcise your heart and don't be stiff-necked. Well, to understand this sentence, we have to remember what circumcision is. Circumcision is the sign of God's covenant with His people, God's relationship with His people. So when God says circumcise your heart, it means that not only keep the sign of the covenant, but keep it in your mind strongly. Because heart, in the Old Testament or in Hebrew, the language of Hebrew, really symbolizes mind rather than emotion. In English, when you say heart, you are talking about emotions mostly. But in the Hebrew language, when they say heart, it is talking about mind. What we would call brain, actually they said heart. So, this is you always have to keep this covenant in mind and act on it. Is what it means to have to circumcise your heart. It also means you have to just think about the meaning of the sign of circumcision, because when circumcision happens, it is to cutting the foreskin, removal of foreskins. It means to remove something that is between you and God. So circumcise your heart means that remove anything that is not appropriate, that is to serve God, or in your way, or that is on your way to serve God. In other words, all the cultural values that we have from our baggage, any other values that we have other than biblical values, we have to remove from us. All the things that we just think dearly, but it's not really godly, we have to remove from our minds. That is what it means to circumcise your heart. Then also the next part is don't be stiff-necked. It is in the analogy of animals. Well, we have a dog next door. She's not barking now, but it's good that she's not barking. But when I try to put a leash on her, she sometimes just run away for fun, but soon she just submits and just wait there. But she doesn't just simply wait, she bows her neck. So when she bows her neck, it means that I'm ready for you to put leash on me. And so she's not stiff-necked. She was stiff-necked before, but bowed-necked later. And that's true with, I guess, other animals too, with oxen, with the yoke. And that's what God means. Submissive to me. Be submissive to me. Don't be stiff-necked. Don't rebel against me, is what God says. For the Lord your God is the God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awe-inspiring God. So God again just talks about His greatness, or Moses talks about God's greatness, how great God is. We have to always keep this in mind. At the same time, He adds more character of God here, showing no partiality and taking no bribes. So God is just and fair. So you cannot bribe God. You have to be obedient to God rather than trying to bribe God. Then he adds one more thing. He extends justice for the fatherless and the widows, and love the resident alien, giving him food and clothing. Wow. So here we see that his justice means he favors those who are disadvantaged in this world. Fatherless and the widows and the resident aliens who are disadvantaged in this world. And we can just expand the list if you want to. God just mentions these people in particular because they are considered the most disadvantaged in this world, at that time anyway. Then comes the command. So if we know that God is such God, then you are also to love the resident alien. Well, first of all, we have to just think about who the resident alien are. Well, the resident alien are practically people who have moved their home culture, home country, homeland. And I think practically all of us here are resident aliens to a certain degree because it includes people who have moved from a couple of generations before as well. But in particular, at that time, people really didn't want to leave their homeland. So those people who left their homeland are mostly out of desperation. Maybe they are displaced because of war or because of famine. So the people who fit the definition of the resident alien most in our culture are the refugees and others whom I call economic refugees, who ran migrant workers or immigrants who came here mainly because the poverty was so big in their home countries. we have to have special care for them. And it's interesting that although God mentioned the fatherless, or Moses mentioned fatherless and widows before, he particularly singled out the resident aliens for this command. And gives the reason this way: since you are resident aliens in the land of Egypt. Well, didn't you experience it yourself? Although they are not resident, they didn't leave their homelands per se when they were in Egypt, because it was their ancestors who left the homeland. But still, you were resident aliens in one sense because of your parents or grandparents, or the few generations before left their homeland. And if we consider that most people in Australia are resident aliens, so we know what it means to live in a foreign country, and we should care for those people who are displaced from their homeland. And therefore, I think I'm very glad that we are doing English classes here for settlers, because it is really great ministry. We have to care for these people who are lonely in this land. We should do more in our individual lives as well. Then he gives more commands by saying, you are to fear the Lord your God and worship him, remain faithful to him, and take oath in his name. And now you are to fear the Lord and your God and worship him. He said it before, but he adds one more element here: remain faithful to him and take oath in his name. And this is the element saying that you should shun away from other gods. You should only just serve God only. And again, we might think that we don't have idols in our generations. We don't have other gods. Of course, we believe in monotheism. But if we say that we believe in God and serve other values, follow other values, mostly from our culture, not recognizing that our cultural values are not necessarily biblical values, then we are really serving other gods as well. We are not being faithful to God. So we have to be faithful only to biblical values, not to other values. And I need to explain the oath part, because our gospel reading said that you are not to take oath at all. So what does God conscious himself by giving one command in one place, on another command in another place? No, because when Jesus said don't take oath at all, it means when you are not required to. For example, when people just say that to just assert their honesty, saying, well, I swear by God, I'm telling the truth. Don't do that, because that's calling the name of God very lightly. You cannot do anything about God, so why do you swear by God? But here, the emphasis is in his name. When you have to make a promise or something, just say not by other God's name, but by other things, but saying, I am responsible to God. I am only responsible to God, because I serve only God. That's what it means. We are to just say, we are only following God and nothing else. And he gives more praise to God, more description of God by saying, he is your praise and he is your God, who has done these great and awe-inspiring works your eyes have seen. So here we see that we have to remember our relationship with God. We have to remember that he is our praise and he is our God, to serve God better. And we also have to remember what God has done. He has done great things to us. And I can remember all the great things that God has done in my life. But Moses is not just talking about individual life, but as collective life, mostly here. Because one thing that he singles out is that when your ancestors went out to Egypt, there were only 70 people. Well, not exactly 70 people if you include women and children, but still, that's so to say. But when you got out of Egypt, remember how big crowd we became. And if we apply this, then what can we say? When we are only 70 people, when Israel, Jacob went to Egypt, but now how many people who follow God? How many Christians in the world? Statistically 2 billion, more than 2 billion. But, well, maybe even to take that most of these people are Christians in name only who do not go to church. If you just count churchgoers, still will be much more than 100 million or even possibly 500 million or so. Isn't that a great number? God has multiplied these people. Isn't God wonderful? And if you remember that God is so wonderful, God has done so great things to you, then we should be more faithful to God. So Moses gave the call to serve God or worship God in this speech. And that speech is as relevant to now as it was to these people. We have to serve God only. God and serve God only. We shouldn't really follow any other values than biblical values. The moment that we just turn to what this world thinks is right, for example, this world thinks that earning lots of money is the great thing to do. If we turn to these kind of wrong things, we are rebelling against God. We have to only follow God's values. And if we really want to follow God's values, if we want to serve God, then good thing to do that is remember who God is. God is great God, who has has created all this world, who owns all these things, God of gods, Lord of lords. At the same time, He cares for each one of us. He has special care for His church. He has special love for God's chosen people. So let us remember this and serve God well. Glory be to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.